Okay. Good afternoon. It is my honor to welcome you to the 30th Annual Joseph M. Foley Lecture. My name is Alan Lerner. I'm chairperson of the Professional Advisory Board of the Cleveland chapter of the Alzheimer's Association, which is the sponsor. The advisory board is comprised of physicians, scientists, and professionals that work to provide up-to-date information from the field to the staff of the Cleveland area chapter. Dr. Foley was one of my teachers, was one of the first to recognize the importance of aging and Alzheimer's disease and its effects on people and their families. He was a groundbreaking and innovative professor for many years. Before introducing our distinguished speaker, I'd like to turn your attention to the materials on the table. At each seat is a flyer outlining the free programs and services of the Cleveland area chapter that support all forms of dementia, not just Alzheimer's disease. Next, you will find a copy of the slides that will be shown during today's program. There are also trial match cards. Trial match is a free, easy-to-use clinical trials system that allows you to find out what's going on in research here in this area and around the country. It's an easy way to learn more about this program and how to sign up on the cards. Please also find the evaluation to be completed at the end of the program. If you wish to earn continuing education unit CEUs this afternoon, you must stay for the entire program. We'll lock the doors and give your completed evaluation to a staff person at the registration table on the way out. Lastly, there is information on your tables about an upcoming program on the Fox Business Channel called Innovations that will be presented on November 11th. It will be about the IDEAS study, which is looking into the clinical usefulness of so-called amyloid PET scans. I would like to introduce Dr. Yaakov Stern, professor of neuropsychology in the Department of Neurology and Psychiatry at Columbia University and the Taub Institute for the Research on Alzheimer's Disease and the Aging Brain. He's also chief of the Cognitive Neuroscience Division of the Department of Neurology. I would just say that Dr. Stern is the world's expert on cognitive reserve, and he's going to inform us about that. His other strong focus of his current research is investigating the neural basis of this idea. He is conducting large-scale imaging studies to identify unique networks in the brain underlying our cognitive abilities affected by aging and models to predict Alzheimer's disease in an individual. So without further ado, Dr. Stern.
Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be here. I'm very honored. I guess 30th is a good number, so maybe I was specifically chosen for that nice round number, but it's really a pleasure. And I have to say I've been here all day and had a lot of nice meetings with various colleagues throughout the day that I've really enjoyed tremendously. Today I'm going to talk about this concept of cognitive reserve. I'm going to start from the very beginning. So those of you who are steeped in it are going to get a review, but I think it's good to step back and understand how the concept developed and where we stand today. Before I start, I always forget to do this at the end, so I like to do it at the beginning. There's a lot of people that work with me who contributed to various aspects of this research that I'm going to present. Really, the people I'm listing are the people who work with me currently. If I had to list all of the people who helped with some of the earlier stuff that I'll show you, it would take way more than 1 or 2 slides. So, and I also want to acknowledge the National Institute on Aging, which supports all of my research. Okay, so here's where things start. I'm sure most of you, or many of you, or all have seen a slide sort of like this, the prevalence of Alzheimer's disease. What this is showing is that as people get older, the percentage of people with Alzheimer's disease increases precipitously. And that's the real problem that we're dealing with, and as you well know, because people are living longer, the prevalence of Alzheimer's disease is expected to shoot up over time, and that's what we're trying to cure. Another thing that we have to recognize along with that is that there's straight-out cognitive aging. This is a graph from Tim Salthouse, who's a cognitive aging researcher, and what it's showing is ages 20 to 30. And these are standardized scores where 0 is average, and this is above and below average. And you can see there's different skills. Let's say reasoning is the triangles. What you see is sort of a straight line going downhill from 20 to 80. So aging is not something that starts when you're older. Age is something that starts as you move year to year, starting from age 20. I have to stress that these are cross-sectional data. That means that they're separate people studied in each of these decades. The data look different if you follow people over time. But aging, we do age. It has nothing to do with Alzheimer's disease. It's just part of what happens to every living creature. This is vocabulary. Sort of crystallized knowledge is called, and that either remains stable or gets better. You know, and when you see a line like this, you wonder what it is that we older people have that we end up running things. So you have to make up something like wisdom or some other quality that neuropsychologists can't measure. Alzheimer's disease, you know, the two key pathologies of Alzheimer's disease are plaques and tangles. These are the amyloid plaques. These are these tau tangles that are in the neurons. Now people are also focusing on neurodegeneration, another feature of the disease that's probably caused by these plaques and tangles. And these are the key hallmarks that a pathologist looks at to make sure that someone has Alzheimer's disease after they die. And as you're probably aware now, there are scans, PET scans available for both of these, so these can be detected during life. The PET scans are interesting. Here's an amyloid PET scan, and this is patients with Alzheimer's disease, and everywhere where you see that bright red, that means that the person has a lot of amyloid in their brain. So that's what you'd expect with someone with amyloid. These are healthy elderly people, no amyloid. But what's interesting, and this is one of the, I put this one on, but this is one of the earliest papers to show that in cognitively normal elder adults, there's some percentage of people that do start to aggregate amyloid in their brains. As a matter of fact, the estimate, let's say age 60 and above or 70 above, maybe 30% of cognitively normal people have amyloid in their brain. And the question is, what does that mean? Does that mean they'll eventually develop Alzheimer's disease or not? Probably a lot of people never will, but it is the first stage of the Alzheimer's process. The same thing with tangles. We can now, here's mainly Alzheimer's patients, and this is another kind of PET scan that labels tangles. And you can see, sorry they didn't give you color pictures, but you see it up here. Widespread tangles in these people with Alzheimer's disease. But even in cognitively normal people, you start to see the spread of, or people without dementia, let's say, you start to see the spread of tangles. And what the researchers are noticing now is that though the presence of amyloid can often be accompanied by really no discernible cognitive changes, as this tau spreads out from here across the brain, you start to see subtle cognitive changes even in cognitively normal people. The reason that I'm showing you these is to make the point that we have two things that go on that I'm going to keep talking about. One is the underlying pathology, plaques and tangles, and I'll show you a bit more in a second. And the other is what we call the dementia, what we see, the cognitive problems and the functional problems. And in a while, I'm going to tell you that although the brain changes cause these cognitive and functional problems, it's interesting and important to think of them separately and how one causes the other. Now, there's other things that contribute to cognitive change, both in people with Alzheimer's disease and in people without, just as a function of aging. And those include losses of brain volume. The brain shrinks. The brain just gets smaller with age. And here you see it again from 20 to 90. And there's a lot of variability across people, but the cortex gets thinner. There's the white matter tracts. That's the neuronal tracts, the axons that connect one place to another, lose integrity. And there's these things called white matter hyperintensities. We wouldn't know about those except once they could see them on scans, but people develop more of those, and they're associated also with bad cognition. So the reason I put these on a separate slide is that a lot of researchers use these to better understand even normal cognitive aging, whereas the plaques and tangles are used more to understand the brain basis for Alzheimer's disease. So that gets us to where I can really start. So we have this brain damage, the plaques, the tangles, the other things I pointed out to you, and we have the clinical outcome. Today we'll talk about Alzheimer's disease. And the clinicians have noted for a very long time that there's not a one-to-one relationship between the degree of brain changes and the clinical outcome. And I'll show you in a little while. Two people can have the same amount of measured Alzheimer's pathology, but look vastly different clinically. That is, in terms of how they do cognitively or functionally. And this concept of reserve is the focus of my talk tonight, was introduced to explain this discontinuity, the lack of a one-to-one relationship. So reserve can explain this disjunction between the degree of damage and the clinical manifestation of that damage. That is what reserve is. There's really, to my mind, I like to partition reserve into two buckets, brain reserve and cognitive reserve. I'll spend most of the night talking about cognitive reserve, but first I'll talk a little about brain reserve. So the first person to, I believe, to coin the term brain reserve was Robert Katzman, who was one of the deans of Alzheimer's research. They did this study up in the Bronx, that's north of where I am in Manhattan, following a lot of elderly people. And Katzman wrote a paper about, I believe it's 12 women who died cognitively normal before death, and they had a lot of plaques and tangles in their brain. This is quite a while ago, and he was puzzled as to why they weren't demented, even though they had so much Alzheimer's pathology in their brain. And he noticed that their brains were much larger than average. And he said maybe they had brain reserve. Now, I'm not sure what he meant exactly, but what I think he meant was that they had more brains or synapses to lose. And I'll explore that with you in a second. The idea that because they had more, they could lose some and not really get demented. Now, more recently, much later than when I started thinking about brain reserve and cognitive reserve, we've learned about this concept of brain maintenance. And that, I'll show you, is very exciting. We just didn't understand this until the last 15 years or so, that the brain is much more plastic than we imagined, and that there's a direct effect of our activities and lifestyle on the brain. And some people have called this brain maintenance. So I'll talk a little bit about that. And the main thing that I'll talk about is the idea of cognitive reserve. The idea of cognitive reserve is, given the brain that we have, how much brain volume there is, how much Alzheimer's pathology, some people will do better than others. And so cognitive reserve describes the resilience or plasticity of cognitive networks in the face of disruption. That is, that how people use their brain allows some people to cope better than others with this Alzheimer's pathology, or with aging too. So that's the cognitive reserve. And I don't know if I really coined the term cognitive reserve, but when I thought of it, it was in direct response to the idea of brain reserve. So I said, oh, this is cognitive reserve. This is how the status of the brain. These are the cognitive networks that help us cope with it. Okay. So this is a figure that Paul Satz, who was a prominent neuropsychologist, published about what he called threshold theory, and I use it to explain brain reserve. So this is what he said. Imagine two people with differing amounts of what he called brain reserve capacity. Now, what he meant by that is not exactly clear, but I think it's sort of what Katzman said, the amount of neurons, the amount of brain material, axons that they have. And he said, imagine these two people, this guy has more than this, they both get the same lesion to the brain, let's say a stroke or Alzheimer's pathology. This person can tolerate that lesion. This person, because he has less brain reserve capacity, that lesion pushes that person below this threshold for functional impairment. So that's more to lose. The person has more to lose. And I think that's the idea of brain reserve, and I call it a passive process. We're not talking about the brain actively trying to combat the effects of these lesions. We're just talking about these lesions quantitatively reducing someone past some threshold. So that's sort of the standard definition of brain reserve. And here's a very old paper. This is Peter Schofield. He's a neurologist in Australia. He was a postdoc with us many, many years ago, and we had this, still have this study in the community where we follow random selection of elders in the North Manhattan community surrounding our hospital up in the northern tip of Manhattan. And Peter was taken with this concept of brain reserve, so he convinced the research assistants to take a tape measure and measure the head circumference of everybody in the study. So what you have here is smallest head circumference to largest. And here you have percent of people with Alzheimer's disease. And you can see a downward trend. As the head circumference gets larger, the prevalence of Alzheimer's disease is smaller. And that's brain reserve. That's simple brain reserve. And there's a lot of epidemiologists who very strongly back this as a partial explanation for why some people can cope with more Alzheimer's pathology than others. Now, brain reserve is not so simple, and that's what I was hinting to you before. The literature now suggests that there's things like exercise and environmental enrichment that really can activate brain plasticity mechanisms, actually change the brain, remodel the neural circuitry in the brain, or actually enlarge the brain. Exercise perhaps can increase vascularization. This is something we never dreamed of. When I was in college and graduate school, we learned that you had a certain amount of neurons as an adult, and as you got older, you would start to lose them, and that was that. But now we know about this thing called neurogenesis, especially in the hippocampus and the dentate. We actually actively grow new neurons all of the time. And people who are more, and animals for sure, who are more active either in terms of exercise or cognitively, actually have more of this neurogenesis. We just didn't imagine that when I was first learning about this stuff. Exercise and cognitive stimulation can change brain volume. I'll show you that in a second. It can influence neuronal survival to insult what they call apoptosis. And it can upregulate certain factors that are important for brain plasticity. So brain reserve is a more active process, and that came in that light. People have suggested this concept of brain maintenance. This is a paper where they're trying to suggest that what's all, sort of like, I think this audience is old enough to remember on Saturday Night Live, Emily Latella, what's all this talk about cognitive reserve? They're saying that this brain maintenance is really more, that in aging, some people just maintain their brain better than others. But it's a complementary concept. And that, so brain maintenance could account for differential brain reserve at any point in time. Here's one of the first papers where they actually showed that when they took people who are couch potatoes, that means they don't exercise very much, and randomized them to aerobic exercise study, these people actually increased volume in their brain in sets of areas. Their brains actually got bigger. And it's not just old people. We just finished a study where we're seeing that in young people. Hopefully it'll be published soon. This is a very interesting old study by Michael Valenzuela. He took elderly people and he measured the size of their hippocampus, an area of the brain that's important for memory. And he divided them into two groups, one that's associated with stimulating activities and one that's one that are performing stimulating activities. He calls his measure the LEQ. And so we have high and low LEQ. And then he looked at the change in hippocampus over time. And the people that engaged in less exercise and stimulating activity showed a greater decline in the volume of their hippocampus than those who were engaging in these activities. So honestly, when I first started thinking about cognitive reserve, I didn't appreciate, we just didn't know how plastic the brain is. But I think it's a complementary concept. This is another finding that's even more intriguing to me, and I'm not sure where it's really going to lead. This is Susan Landau, a very nice paper. She works with Bill Jagust, they're out in Berkeley, and they do studies similar to some that I do, where they bring in cognitively normal elders, very carefully tested. And as part of their studies, they imaged them with this amyloid tracer. It's a PET tracer that can detect the amount of amyloid. And here's a graph of this PIB uptake. That's the amount of this tracer that these people have, where more is worse, more amyloid and less. And this is past cognitive activity score. They gave them this scale, this Wilson scale, that asked them about cognitive and physical activities during midlife. And they showed that the people that had more activities had less uptake of amyloid tracer. Now, that's pretty wild. Can there be certain cognitive or exercise functions that might minimize Alzheimer's pathology? In animal models, there's some evidence for it. I think the jury is out, but it's really intriguing. And to me, that's the ultimate in brain reserve. Okay, now let's move to cognitive reserve. That's as much as I'm going to talk about brain reserve and brain maintenance. Cognitive reserve. So I showed you the graph about brain reserve by SATs. So when I wrote a review quite a while ago about cognitive reserve, I modeled my figure after his. So here's two people. Now they have the same amount of brain reserve capacity. Their neurons, synapses, brain volume are exactly the same. But this patient can handle a much larger lesion to the brain than this patient before they start to show impairment. And why is that? Because of what's actively going on here. So even with a smaller amount of brain, this person can maintain function, whereas this person loses the function at a much higher level of the brain, perhaps because their cognitive networks are not as resilient or as robust. So that's the concept of cognitive reserve. And I'll build it up. If it's not quite clear yet, I'll repeat it in a lot of ways as we go on. Okay, so how did this all start? So how does someone get interested in a topic like this? You know, in science, you know, you can read stuff in journals, but very often, even before things get published, you go to conferences and there's sort of a buzz. You start to hear about what people are doing. So many years ago, I used to go regularly to the Academy of Neurology, and the big talk was that Katzman was finding that there was a lower prevalence of Alzheimer's disease in people with higher education. So I'll say it the opposite way too, that people with lower education, there were more patients with Alzheimer's disease, and people with higher education, there were less. Now, this was a long time ago, and even when I became interested in it, people thought this was a little crazy. The idea that you have this bad disease attacking the brain and something like education could make a difference was very, very fringy. But I had a different problem with it. They were assessing, in order to diagnose Alzheimer's disease in these big epidemiologic studies, they were using a mental status examination, a short examination. And I'm a neuropsychologist, and what we know is that people do differently on tests as a function of their education. And that actually we have special norms for tests. What we expect from a college graduate is different than what we expect from someone who went to 8th grade, even for a memory test, whatever test we give. So my concern was that they were making a diagnostic error. So the people with higher education were doing better on the test than the people with lower education, and they were making a mistake. So it wasn't really that education had any impact on Alzheimer's disease. They were just making a diagnostic error. And I was very intrigued with that. And at the same time that I was thinking about that, we were engaged, we really were just starting a study, as I mentioned before, in North Manhattan, where we were following elders over time. And I realized that I was in a good position to investigate this idea of education in Alzheimer's disease. So let's review what I was telling you before. Here's advancing Alzheimer's pathology. Now, we know that the Alzheimer's pathology begins maybe 20 even more years before a person starts to show any changes. So something initiates that pathology, maybe genetics, there might be various things that promote it, let's say maybe head injury. At some point, the symptoms get bad enough that that people start to notice them, the person or their family. Eventually they get bad enough that they go in and they get a diagnosis, and then the disease progresses. The idea of reserve would be that for people with higher reserve or higher education, the clinical symptoms would appear later when the disease is more advanced, whereas in people with lower education, they would appear earlier. And the best way to test that was not by going out and looking at who had high and low education and looking at the percent of people with high and low education. The best way to test that, I thought, and epidemiologists would say, is with something called an incidence study. That means you start with people who are not demented. They pass all your tests, so we don't have to worry about a diagnostic error. You follow them over time, and you look to see who gets demented. And that's what we did, and that's this table here. This is from an old paper. So here we followed about 600 people in the North Manhattan community. High and low education was cut at 8 years. And you can see the key thing is this: the people with lower education had double the risk of developing Alzheimer's disease over the 4 to 5 year follow-up period. We did the same thing with occupational attainment. The people with lower occupational attainment, just sort of dividing it in half on a scale, also had about double the risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. So my interpretation of this was that the educational experiences and the occupational experiences were not directly affecting the Alzheimer's pathology, but that they were helping people cope better with it, so that they gave people the ability to last longer as the disease progressed, so they were diagnosed after the disease was more severe. And we even fooled around with it. If you go to the paper, we looked at people with low education versus low versus people with high education and high occupation, and there was like 4 times the benefit of higher education and higher occupation. So they were acting independently of one another. So this was one of the first incidence studies to show that educational and occupational attainment helped forestall. Now it doesn't get rid of Alzheimer's disease. It doesn't get rid of the pathology. When I published this paper, I got a very irate letter from a woman whose husband was a Nobel Prize winner. And basically she said, "What kind of an idiot are you?" I think she used a more harsher term than that. More harsh term than that. My husband was a Nobel Prize winner, and he had severe Alzheimer's. So the point is not that higher education or occupation is going to prevent the disease in every case. It just means that you can cope with the pathology longer. Now maybe if you live long enough or die early enough, you might never get the disease, but once it breaks through, it's going to break through anyway. So I think I have to be very clear about that. I don't expect you to read this. So when we first put out this paper, the epidemiology was going this way and that way, and people really didn't quite believe it. They said, oh, maybe the people in North Manhattan are different, or this or that. So this is what's called a meta-analysis. Someone, it's done quite a while ago in 2005. There's been other ones since, where they go and they review every single paper that's been done, every single paper that's looked at education, occupation, premorbid IQ, and leisure activity in the exact same kind of incidence study that I described. And any time that these bars, they're called confidence intervals, don't cross 1, that means they found a protective effect. And you can see that the great preponderance of studies really replicated. That's what you have to do with epidemiology. It's not like cloning a gene. Every population is different. There could be different measures. So it's really doing it over and over again and convincing yourself. So they added in, I already told you about education and occupation. What they added in were 2 other things that we looked at later too: leisure activities engaged in later in life, and then premorbid IQ. IQ that you probably have, from age 13 and on. Okay, so that's cognitive reserve to my mind. That was one of the first things that convinced me of the idea of cognitive reserve. What about in normal aging? So what you might expect in normal aging is that, as I showed you that probably a lot of the cognitive changes in normal aging are caused by brain changes like shrinkage of the brain or the cortex or changes in the white matter. So maybe you would predict that people with higher reserve which show a slowed rate of cognitive decline. This is a very early paper by Jennifer Manley when she was my postdoc, again from the North Manhattan study from cognitively normal people. She took people with high and low literacy. This was her big advance, was to the realization that years of education don't tell you that much because every educational experience is different. So she measured literacy as a better way of quantitatively classifying education. Here's the people with high literacy, low literacy, and you can appreciate that people with low literacy are having a more rapid rate of decline. The studies on this are mixed, although the preponderance of studies come out this way. Later on, a more recent postdoc, Laura Zahodny, revisited that in the North Manhattan study. And here's even people between 9 and 20 years using some very, very fancy statistics. And she's showing a more rapid rate of decline for the person with 9 years than 20 years. And the same thing works within the lower education range. So I think even in cognitive aging, education seems to slow the rate of cognitive aging. And then this is the one that takes a little more explanation. What about an Alzheimer's disease? So I'm explaining to you that this cognitive reserve might allow people to resist the effects of the pathology longer, so they get demented later. Now, does that mean that once someone develops Alzheimer's disease, they're going to have a slower rate of decline? So the answer is no. And this graph is like a theoretical graph that helps to explain this idea. So let me see if I can explain it to you. So here's Alzheimer's neuropathology, progressing over time as before, getting worse and worse. This is some memory test score. It could be any evaluation. So the person with higher education would start maybe higher at the beginning. They just do better. As I explained to you, just normatively, that's what happens. Now this thing here is what I've been explaining to you, that because of their higher reserve, the person with higher education or higher reserve will not be affected by the pathology till the disease is more advanced than the person with lower education. So that's a change point. So that's one assumption of this model. The other is this common endpoint. What that is saying is that once Alzheimer's disease is really there, it's bad. I mean, those of you who have relatives or friends with Alzheimer's, you know, it really, even in the most intelligent person, really impairs you. So at some point, it gets bad enough that no matter how much reserve you have, you're going to be equal. Now, if you agree with this delayed change point and this common endpoint, then what you get after that is something interesting. The rate of decline, once the disease sets in, is slower in the person with lower reserve than the person with higher reserve. It's sort of counterintuitive. The way I would think of it is you have more good time and less bad time. That's what's going on there. And here's the very first paper where we reported that. We were the first to report that. These are, this is over time. These are Alzheimer's patients, again, from the Manhattan study, carefully matched at baseline, and the people with higher education actually decline more rapidly than the people with lower education. And then this has been replicated many times. This is sort of my favorite. This is Charlie Hall. He's back in the Bronx study, the Einstein study that Katzman had been working in. And they were following people over time, giving the exact same memory test that we give. And this is the time until people were diagnosed as demented. And this is called a spaghetti plot. You can see why. Each one of these is an individual person that they followed, and what they have here is just their memory test score. And then Charlie has this way of modeling the data. He's a statistician. Let me see if I can get you to see it. So he models the change point and then the rate of decline. So here's the people with the lowest education, the dark blue. You see their change point, and then their decline is sort of slower until they reach the dementia point. Here's the people with the highest education, the green. Their change point is much later with a faster rate of decline. And this has been demonstrated over and over again. So the bottom line is that once someone starts to succumb to the pathology, the person with higher reserve has more rapid decline than the person with lower. See where I am. Okay, now I mean, one thing to say, I mean, even at this point, is that the Alzheimer's Association always puts out a statistic like this, and I think it's very relevant to what we're talking about. If the onset of Alzheimer's disease could be forestalled by, let's say, 5 years, the prevalence of the disease would be dramatically reduced. The number that they say is different all the time, 50%, 40%. Why is that? Because there's a certain amount of people that would die because of the disease of aging before they ever get demented. And that would be particularly beneficial for the people with higher reserve. So because people have higher reserve, a greater percentage of them are going to escape ever getting demented. Okay, now this graph reviews what I've been saying so far to get you to the next point that I want to make. So this is a theoretical graph that sort of summarizes a lot of what I've been saying. Here's Alzheimer's disease from mild to severe. Here's clinical severity. Here I put in, instead of a test or something, normal, mild cognitive impairment. You're probably familiar with that sort of a phase when people have some cognitive problems but don't have dementia, mild dementia to severe. And then these are theoretical lines. This is someone with low reserve. When the Alzheimer's pathology is mild, they have less severe Alzheimer's disease, and when it gets more severe, they have more severe Alzheimer's disease. This is a theoretical high reserve person, so as I'm saying, perhaps when the pathology is milder, this person will not be demented, but by the time the pathology is moderate, they're demented too. But even though they're both demented, this guy is less demented than this guy. So given, this is the key thing to look at. So let's take this line of mild AD. So mild AD, the person with low reserve would have this amount of pathology. The people with high reserve would have this amount, much more pathology. So it was sort of a thought experiment that if you match people for their clinical severity, the people with low reserve should have less pathology in their brain than the people with high reserve. Make clear? I mean, it's just a bit of a thought. Because they can handle more pathology at any clinical level, they'll have more. And I wanted to prove that because I'd already done the epidemiology, and that I thought that's what was going on. I mean, that's how I was explaining all the epidemiology, but I had never related it to the underlying pathology. Now, the way to do that best would be with an autopsy study. Let's say you have two people. Their mental status is the same and their function is the same and all of that. Any kind of clinical measure looks the same, but one is high education and one low. We would expect, if we looked into their brain, they both have Alzheimer's disease. If we looked into their brain, that the person with higher education should have more plaques and tangles. But when I was thinking about this was a long time ago, we didn't have such path data. The studies hadn't been done yet. It was a while ago. We just didn't have it. But we were doing something else at the time. We were giving people a kind of brain imaging, sort of like FDG PET, glucose PET, but it was called xenon. And the thing about that kind of a PET scan, it's not an amyloid or a tau PET, it's the regular PET scan most of you are used to hearing about, is that there's a signature change in the brain. The PET scan measures glucose, which is brain metabolism. So there's a signature set of changes that occur to the brain when people start to develop Alzheimer's disease. First, they lose metabolism in the temporal-parietal area, and then also frontally. So I said, could we use this PET measure, this cerebral blood flow measure, as a metabolism measure, as a surrogate for the pathology? And my prediction would be that if we match people for clinical severity, Alzheimer's patients, and we look at this kind of a metabolism scan, the people with higher education will show more of a loss, more of that Alzheimer's signature. So I had this idea. We were doing this study for other reasons where we were imaging a lot of Alzheimer's patients. And I went to my research assistant at the time. His name was Gene Alexander, who's now a full professor in Arizona. I gave him the idea. And the next day, he came back to me with a whole set of data, including this picture. And let me see if I'll work you through it. This is 20, 20, and 20 Alzheimer's patients. These three groups are matched for clinical severity, and this is above high school graduate below. And you can see in this temporal parietal area, this blue, which is a reduction in metabolism is much more severe in the people with the higher education than the people with the lower education. As if these people are walking around with more pathology than these, even though they look clinically the same. This was really the very first paper on cognitive reserve that I published. I found it very exciting. I thought it would be on the cover of Science, but it didn't work out that way. But my friends make fun of me because I never give a talk about cognitive reserve without showing this picture. So I'll sneak it in somehow. So I was very excited by this because it puts everything together. Remember, there's three things that you have to think about with reserve. The underlying pathology, which we're measuring with this PET, the clinical status, which I'm telling you is equated here, and then the reserve, which in this case, the reserve factor, which in this case is education. So what we're showing is that this education is moderating the effect of the pathology on clinical status. Now, later on comes David Bennett. He was doing this religious order study where everybody is priests and nuns throughout the country, and they all agreed to donate their brains. So Dave has the brains that I wanted to look at. This is quite a time later. And he could do the exact same analysis now, not with a surrogate, but with actual pathology. So here's a summary measure of Alzheimer's pathology. Here's global cognitive function, prior as close to death as they could get it. And he gets this effect. So let's take about this amount. Let's go to this amount of cognitive function. And the person with 15 years has this amount of pathology. The person with 18 years has a lot more. Even in those very high age ranges, he's showing this effect where the matching for clinical severity, you're seeing more AD pathology in the people with higher education. So to me, that was the other piece to, like another nail in the coffin of evidence for this idea of reserve. And this has been replicated over and over and over again. So it's right. So that's pretty much the type of evidence that's aggregated over the years that's convinced me that there is something like cognitive reserve. These life experiences, educational attainment, maybe premorbid IQ, then educational attainment, occupational attainment, leisure activities. Other people have looked at other things like social networks. There's probably other activities as well that provide this stimulation during life, experience during life that promotes this reserve and allows people to cope with brain pathology better. Then I said, well, how does it work in the brain? So, because I'm waving my hands a little, like I'm saying that somehow these people have more robust cognitive networks, they have more flexibility in problem solving. Can I try to understand how that's implemented in the brain? And it was just at the time when brain imaging became popular. It was a little before fMRI, but people started looking at the brain using imaging and looking at people doing cognitive tasks during imaging. And I said, wow, maybe I can use this brain imaging, this functional brain imaging, to understand how reserve is implemented. And my first grant went something like this. I'm going to take Alzheimer's patients, match them for clinical severity, and I'm going to have people with high and low education. I'll give them a task in the scanner, and I'll see what they do differently, what looks different in the scan, which I think is very reasonable. And the reviewers said, well, what do you expect to see? Do you expect more activation or less activation? Where do you expect to see it? All these very picky questions. So I could say that really I'm doing that kind of study now, but I write much better grants now. So here's what we're doing now. This is an ongoing study. We've already done this study on 70 young people, 20 to 30, and maybe 130 older people, 60 to 70, and now we're actually following them up. So I'll just give you the logic of it and quickly show you a little bit of results because it gets a little technical. So a lot of this will look familiar. So here we are. We can measure all these Alzheimer's or AD-related pathology, age or Alzheimer's-related pathology, and I already listed most of it for you. Amyloid burden with the PET, resting CBF, cerebral blood flow I showed you, white matter tract integrity, white matter hyperintensity burden, cortical thickness volume. We can measure all that. We can measure how people do on cognitive tests or the tests we give them in the scanner. And as I tried to explain to you, we believe that all these brain changes are responsible for these cognitive changes, but we also believe that there's these activities like education, literacy, leisure, etc., that moderate that effect, that allow the people with higher education to perform better in the face of a certain level of brain. So basically, I'm just trying to use imaging to instantiate everything that I'm telling you. So the new thing that we added in was studies in the scanner. We give people tasks in the scanner, and we look to see how the areas in the brain that light up and the degree to which they light up. And we give them two tasks. One is a working memory task. In this one, they see 1, 3, or 6 letters. We wait a while, and then we give them a letter, and they have to say, yes, no, that was one that I studied. It's called working memory. In this one, it's called a set switching task. When they see a green letter, they have to do one thing with it, like say, is it a vowel or a consonant? If they see a red letter, they have to see if it's uppercase or lowercase. Sometimes we just give them all green letters or all red, but sometimes we intermix them and they have to switch back and forth between the two. That's called executive function task switching. These are two functions that I thought would be good to look at. And one of the key things that I was interested in was looking at what happens as I made the tasks harder. What do people do as I make the tasks harder? What kind of activation occurs? Because I figured that as we challenge the brain, we might get insight into this cognitive reserve. Okay. So this is just sort of a little lecture on using functional imaging. A lot of functional imaging, fMRI, you probably see these things in the newspaper sometimes. Here's the area where Republicans light up when they watch a commercial, and here's the area where Democrats. It's a lot about mapping functions of the brain. What I'm more interested in here are individual difference questions. What do individuals do differently that might account for cognitive reserve? And the hypothesis is that cognitive reserve operates through individual differences in how the brain, how tasks are processed in the brain. So we challenge people with a task, and we look to see what they do differently as a function of our cognitive reserve variables. And I won't give you too much of this, but here are some brief results. So here's a paper that's in press. We've done a lot of this, but this is something new, so I figured I'll show you something new. Here we're challenging people with this set switching task, and we're looking at either the just doing the task or doing the set switching task as opposed to baseline. This is one task versus baseline or the other. And we're looking at areas that activate. These areas that are activating, remember, this is not a picture of areas activating. This is just a statistical graph. That's the secret you have to remember whenever you see these maps of fMRI. It's just statistics. So these are areas that activate, but the key thing is this. What I'm graphing here are as a function of measured reserve, education and IQ, the people with higher IQ, as they go from a baseline to one of our tasks, are activating less. There's a negative correlation between their degree of activation and our cognitive reserve measure. And that's something that we see very often. I mean, it sounds very simplistic. That is that there's some networks that are involved to do set switching, and for the people with higher reserve, as measured with education and IQ, they don't have to work them as hard. They're more efficient. They don't have to activate as much in order to do the task. The people with lower reserve have to use those networks more. The people with lower reserve use them less. I call that efficiency, and we've shown over and over again that there's greater efficiency of the networks doing tasks as a function of reserve. The other thing we've shown is greater capacity. When you push people really hard, the people with higher reserve those networks can step it up and get to that higher level. The people with lower reserve can't. This is how I can explain it to you. Let's say you take me and a very well-trained swimmer, and you ask me to swim 2 laps, and she swims 2 laps. I can do it. She does it. I come out huffing and puffing from my 2 laps. she comes out, doesn't make a dent. That's greater efficiency. Now, we're both challenged to swim a mile. I get about halfway through and I'm finished. And she can do it. I mean, it's a hard work, but she can do it. She has much greater capacity. So it's sort of an analogy to what we see in the brain, this higher efficiency and higher capacity. Then there's one other concept. Let me see if I can explain it to you. I was sorry I left out one slide here, but I'll try to explain this to you. This is Wami O, who was working in our group. Here what Wami did is we have amyloid PET on all of these people that were in our fMRI study, and she divided them into two groups. Those that had very little or no amyloid in their brain, according to PET, and those who had a lot. And the people who had a little, what she found is sort of what I was just showing you, that in the typical areas that are activated, the people with higher reserve activated less. They were more efficient. In the people that were amyloid positive, she found something interesting, that the people with higher reserve actually activated some extra areas that the people with lower reserve did not. Now, I'm going to tell you that what I think is going on is that these people are compensating for the amyloid. The part I'm leaving out is a subtle point, and let me see if I can make it clear to you. There's something interesting when we divide our people into those who have amyloid and those who don't. Remember, we're working with people 60 to 70, and we screen them so they're very, very normal, right? They have to pass all our tests because I don't want them to have any hint of dementia or MCI. So that if they have amyloid in their brain, remember I just explained this to you before, the people who have higher reserve could have more in their brain than the people with lower reserve. And that's really what's going on. The people with higher reserve have more amyloid in their brain than the people with lower reserve. And what we find them doing is reaching out to extra areas in order to do the task. It's something that cognitive psychologists call compensation. They're able to use some extra brain resources in order to do the task. That's all I'm going to show you about imaging. I'm glad to go on and on. I could do a whole separate lecture, but I just wanted to give you a taste of the kind of things that we're trying to do to understand it. The key thing to remember is that I'm just trying to instantiate what I'm telling you. I want to get a good picture of the brain substrate itself, a good picture of performance, and then try to see how the brain activates and differs in activation as a function of reserve. And hopefully that'll teach us about how reserve is implemented. Okay. The other thing that I thought about, I'm sorry, I promised you I was finished, but I'm not, is that what I was looking about, I forgot about these two slides. How is reserve implemented? So here I'm giving people tasks and looking at differences in how they do that task. So is reserve just an aggregation of sets of skills? So like as a clinician, I'll test somebody, I have tested someone, let's say, who was a tailor during life, and she's very bad on all of our tests, but very good on some visuospatial tasks. It's, oh, she was a tailor. Maybe that skill that she built up is helping her there. Or is reserve sort of a generic thing that helps people do many tasks? So what I was hoping here is to find a set of brain areas that is activated across multiple different tasks and is used more by people with higher reserve than lower reserve. And so what we did is we gave people 12 different tasks and fished out a set of brain areas that are used across all these 12 different tasks, and they're used more by people with higher IQ than lower IQ. So I call it a task-invariant cognitive reserve network. Here's a picture of it. You don't have it in color, but there it is. And then there's two cool things about it. First of all, we showed we can actually look at that network in a totally different activation task, and we can show that here's the expression of that pattern, and the people with higher IQ use it more than people with lower. So we fished it out of 12 different tasks, but it's active in other tasks as well. And here's sort of the key thing is that here we look at a relationship between loss of thickness in the cortex and some cognitive task. And we show that the people who use this network more are are more resistant to thinner cortex. So here's the cortex thin. These are the people who have lower use of this network. They're really doing more poorly as the cortex gets thinner. These people with higher use of this network are resisting more and can do better in the face of that. Why do I want to get a network like this? Well, first of all, from a theoretical point of view, it's sort of interesting. But also, I think that if we could fish out or determine, quote, cognitive reserve networks, we have something measurable. Let's say I want to do a study where I increase cognitive reserve. I have an outcome measure to use for it. So, okay, now I'm done with imaging. What's the clinical implications of reserve? I think when I first said this was startling to people, but now I think everyone sort of accepts it. Two individuals who appear the same clinically, whether demented or non-demented, can have widely divergent levels of underlying age-related neural changes or AD pathology. So there's this disjunction between clinical and pathological. So the clinical diagnosis of aging or MCI or Alzheimer's disease could be accompanied by minimal pathology or more than enough to meet pathological criteria. And so I think that measuring cognitive reserve becomes a very important part of diagnosing and characterizing aging and dementia. Now, clinicians sort of do that intuitively. So a clinician will very often say, well, where'd you go to school? What kind of work did you do? And they'll sort of judge people on that basis. That's the intuitive way. But what we're showing is that these life exposures really make a difference. So understanding reserve becomes important. Now, I was writing all of this before I had a very interesting discussion. I gave a talk at lunchtime about how people are paying more and more to these markers of Alzheimer's pathology, the PET markers of amyloid or tau, or you can do it in the spinal fluid and these measures of neurodegeneration. So people are beginning to try to characterize Alzheimer's by this pathology. And so now we're saying, well, that's one piece of it, but you've got to understand these individual differences and the susceptibility to it. And the people who are making these models actually draw like a confidence interval around their pathology measures because some people will do better and worse. So the optimal evaluation of age-related cognitive change or Alzheimer's should include measures of the pathology and really some kind of insight into the person's cognitive reserve. Now, this type of evaluation is important for early diagnosis and characterization. And you might be aware that someone who has more cognitive reserve exposures, higher education, occupational attainment, really could last longer before they develop Alzheimer's disease. Now, for prognosis, it's really important. Because remember, I told you that people with higher reserve might decline more rapidly. And I think most physicians here would say they've seen this clinically. Someone who's really very distinguished person, and they come in, they have early AD, it's sort of mild, and within a year or two, they really drop very quickly. Now, that's important for clinical trials, because clinical trials right now really just take into account the rate of change over time of some outcome measure in the drug and the placebo group. So a mismatch in reserve could really mess up a trial. And it's important for just prognosis in general. Finally, can we intervene? So what would reserve-based interventions be? Could they work? And there's two kinds of interventions we could think of: increase brain reserve or increase brain reserve, that's this line, make the brain better, maybe eliminate pathology, or allow people to deal with the pathology better. Can we intervene? So this is a theoretical slide from Marcus Richards. He worked with me. Now he's with the British birth cohort. And they follow people from birth. They started randomizing people. They got all of the children born in 1 week in England after World War II. They studied their mothers too. They were worried about fertility problems. Then there was the baby boom, so they stopped worrying about that, but they kept following these people over time. So he has father's occupation, cognition at 8 years, education by age 26, occupation. He has leisure activity too, and then he had some cognitive measure at age 53. So there's 2 points to this graph. One is you could say to me, look, Yaakov, someone's born with a higher IQ, so they get a better education, they get a better occupation. Of course, they're going to just do better over life. And these other experiences don't mean anything. So what Marcus is showing here is that there's an independent path from cognition, education, and occupation. Each one is influencing cognition. So each one is contributing separately. Now, why am I showing this in the context of intervention? Well, in the subsequent papers, he showed that late life leisure activities also have their own independent path. And you can imagine intervening later. Can we do something over here that can influence outcome? So the sad news is, for me, that one of the best things you can do is exercise. I was never an exerciser. But exercise, countless studies have taken people who don't exercise, randomized them into like stretching toning versus an aerobic exercise condition. Their brains change, their cognition gets better. Exercise is really good for you. My wife used to, I really try to exercise now, but my wife's a social worker. She's very good at intervention. She said, every time you get up and talk about exercise, I want you to admit in public that you don't do it. So I sort of turned it into a wife joke, but she really did it. So, and actually now I really try. But I do. So exercise is good for you. Physical activity. Here's a neat graph. Another thing is diet. So Nick Skarmeus, who was in our group, now is back in Greece, showed that the Mediterranean diet is very useful. Now, I think that both physical activity and diet are really part of brain maintenance. They really affect the brain itself. And here, this is a very nice paper where he shows that the people who exercise and do the Mediterranean diet have a much reduced risk of developing Alzheimer's than the people who do neither. And so these are straightforward prevention measures. Cognitive intervention, very, very difficult. It's very difficult. This is the biggest study that was ever done. It's an active study. I really put it up there just so I can remember the N. What's that say? 28,000 people, something like that. 2,800 people, a lot of people randomized into a memory training, a reasoning training, and a speed training. Bottom line was that after a period of time, those who were trained on memory did a little better on memory tests. Those who did better on reasoning did a little better on reasoning tests, etc. But there was really no what we call generalization. It's not the kind of thing that's going to prevent Alzheimer's disease. And the problems with cognitive intervention are that the effect sizes are small, and we're not sure that what you train people to do is really going to affect day-to-day activities. Does it generalize to day-to-day functions? Is it sustained? A lot of issues. I'm not saying that there can't be some really good cognitive intervention. There's some very focused ones. But I would say that most of what's sold out there commercially, it's better to just do what you like to do. Just stay active, do whatever leisure activities you like, social activities. If you like crossword puzzles, great. If you don't, there's no reason to say, doing one crossword puzzle a day is a magic solution. I just don't think we're there. What I think we're really at, and the kind of things that people are doing now, are taking healthy elders and doing very intensive, extensive combined interventions with long-term follow-up. And the one that I can point to is this finger study. That's a study from Finland. A cool thing that you have to do now is make up a neat acronym for your study. This is Finnish something or other. It's a finger study. Look what they did here. Nutrition intervention, exercise, cognitive training, helping people monitoring for vascular risk over a long period of time. The cognitive training was really based on some good science. And they did this on a large group of people. This was just published recently, 2015. And they showed, in general, that the people in their training group, these are not really real numbers, these are representations of their statistics. It's a little tricky, but the people showed great, on average, across the two groups, both groups improved in cognition over time, but the people in their training improved more. And when you look at people who got worse, the people in the training were less likely to get worse. So that's I think that's sort of a model to take away, is that, we need to exercise, we need to be heart healthy, we need to stay active. All of those things are going to promote brain and cognitive reserve. Okay, conclusions. So I hope I've convinced you that the epidemiologic and imaging evidence support this concept of reserve. And I think it's important to recognize that it's malleable and influenced by aspects of experience at every stage of life. Maybe better the earlier stuff. We can talk about that during the Q&A. There's two forms of reserve to my mind. There's brain reserve, which is a passive kind of reserve, but it's supported by this brain maintenance over time, and then cognitive reserve. And the concept of cognitive reserve is applicable to a wide range of conditions. So I've talked about aging and Alzheimer's, but it's not reserved just for that. Huh? It's not just for Alzheimer's and aging. I've seen it used in the context of multiple sclerosis, HIV, childhood brain damage, etc. It's a very generic concept. I hinted to you that I think that these imaging studies can help us understand how it's implemented. And I think the key point is that influencing reserve may delay or reverse the effects of aging or brain pathology. So it's a hopeful message. The reserve is a hopeful message. I think we have to be very realistic. That doesn't mean that you'll never get demented, but you might forestall it for a period of time. And I think the worst thing that could happen is someone who gets demented and says, wow, I didn't do enough of this or enough of that. It's a horrible disease. We don't know really how to treat it yet, and it really is just a tragic thing that overtakes a lot of us. But anyway, I think that the reserve is a hopeful part of the story. So thank you very much for your attention. I think before questions, we'll have some sage words, right? Sage words. Yes.
Yeah, I'm always fascinated by how many people somebody has worked with and what they're doing now. Greece, places all over the world. Yeah. So you can see what an important and influential idea this is. And of course, you have to want to do it, right? I mean, and nobody's ever going to say, should I play the saxophone or the harmonica? Right? Because if you don't want to do it, it's not going to happen, and therefore the story's over. But thank you, Dr. Stern. At this time, we'd like to open the floor for questions. Please raise your hand, and either Jamie or Rebecca will make their way over to you with the microphone. And thank you very much. That's great.
Thank you. Yeah, they even did studies with rats where they either made them exercise or allowed them to exercise. You have to want to do it. It really has a different effect. Yeah, well, you need a microphone, though. Let's see who, sorry. One over here, one over there.
We have one right here.
Okay.
Yeah, okay, so I have a couple of questions / kind of statements. When you mentioned that, that education and occupation plays a role in their cognitive reserve, I couldn't help but to think about people that are more educated and have better job opportunities, also have more access to health care, also have better diets, better opportunities, possibly better support systems, not necessarily though. And so I'm wondering if, particularly people in other countries where maybe they don't have the jobs or the education, but they have that access to really good food and perhaps better health care. So that's one comment / question I was wondering if you were taking a look at. And also, I was wondering if you ever studied kind of like the disparity between people, whether or not they were educated or not, but when talking about, I hope I'm making sense, but when talking about the cognitive reserves, if you ever took a look at people that were told that they had dementia versus people that were not told, and if that made a difference in your work.
Okay.
Thank you.
So those are two separate questions. The first one is it's really a key, because when you do epidemiologic studies, you don't have any real control. You're just looking at the world and trying to make sense of it. So when I want to make the claim that people with higher education have a reduced risk of becoming demented because of cognitive reserve, there could be all these competing reasons. Better access to health care, they eat better, etc. So what you try to do in epidemiology studies is either match people or control for those factors, and you try to look at different populations in different ways. Yeah, but so like that first JAMA paper that I showed you, after I sent it in, I added in about 2 pages to the results and discussion, because the reviewers asked me the exact same questions that you're asking, and I had to try to show that they didn't differ in vascular risk, they didn't differ in this and that. But yeah, those are always concerns when you do epidemiologic studies. And there's other ways. I just read a fascinating paper, but you also have to think of alternate ways to do it. So I just read this very cool paper. There's like 3 now like this. The geneticists of isolated genes associated with educational attainment. Now, what that means is not clear. There was an article in Nature a few years ago where they found 75 genes that were associated with increased educational attainment. So there's this idea that instead of looking at actual education, you look at those genes, and that's a much fairer estimate of the effects of education. Because whether you got the education or not, you have these genes for it, although the genes sort of cause the education. It's a very theoretical point. But anyway, in those types of studies, they've also shown a very strong education effect. Anyway, your other question is about people knowing versus not knowing that they have the disease. That isn't really related to what I've been talking about. That's sort of people's fear that if someone is upset about something or depressed, it could be bad for them. Everybody has their bias about that. You know, the bias where I work is that a patient has the right to know what they have. I think it's been studied. I think that very often the reaction is not as precipitous as you might imagine, because people want to know what's going on. But that's not reserve related. That's more of a question about should you protect people or not, and is it bad if they really know? You can. The same thing has been said about cancer or other medical problems as well. You know, my bias is that people have a right to know, and that you shouldn't hide it. But you know, someone might argue with me. But that's philosophy. Yes.
Several questions, please, and I'm a caregiver.
Yes.
The first question I have is, we are beginning to use an awful lot of medications on people with dementia, not only Alzheimer's, but other kinds of dementia, and there's really no decision on whether it's effective or not. I was wondering how you feel about that. The next question I have is your population sample that you used. Surely there's a very big difference between the elderly Holocaust survivor and the African American janitor and the Russian immigrant.
Right.
I would like to know how that was controlled, please.
Okay.
The other question I have is, how sure can research be when you have so many comorbidities in the elderly?
Okay, so those are 3 questions. Let me see if I remember them. Okay, the first one is about the effectiveness of medication. That's a very interesting question. You know, the medications the key medication there's 2 that doctors prescribe for Alzheimer's. The first one is typically Aricept. It doesn't cure the disease. Studies have shown that it has some effect, and the decision of whether it's continuing to have an effect is hard. But there have been withdrawal studies showing that when you take it away, things get worse. And you know, we've talked. My colleagues and I have talked about that. And you know, the truth is that these are not home run drugs. You know, so that's a decision between you know, the patient, the family, and the neurologist or the treating physician about whether it's worth continuing these medications or not. That's not a reserve-y question. Your last question was similar to the other person's. People are different. There's different experiences. Yeah, so these studies have to be done all over the world in different ways. I mean, to me, the best studies are where we have some measure of the brain and we're showing that given that you can do it both ways, but given a certain level of pathology status, some people are doing better than others. Yes, and the third question was more individual differences and drugs, and what was the third question? Comorbidities. Yeah, so I mean, as I said in response before, yeah, you have to try to measure them as best you can. Now, the optimal studies to do all of this, really, epidemiology is observational. Really, the optimal thing would be to take a very large sample of elders, randomize them to a cognitive reserve intervention and a non-cognitive reserve intervention, and see who declines more rapidly or gets demented more rapidly. These are big, expensive studies. So what's really happening most of the time is something like the finger study. They're saying, let's not just rely on the stimulation that I'm talking about. Let's throw the kitchen sink at people because we want to have something that, we're spending a lot of money on this. But the beauty of the randomization is that it takes care of a lot of this. So in epidemiology, you try to control for it, you do multiple populations, multiple ways, measure those comorbidities, and that's the best that you can do. Yeah. Yeah, you've been waiting.
You kind of answered my question just now. I was saying your studies with intelligence in
Right.
preventing Alzheimer's was just looking at people in New York City or just Manhattan. What's your feeling? Could they be replicated in Japan or Cleveland or
They have
Europe?
been.
They have been.
Okay. I mean, I showed you that list. That was there's like 50 studies. There's multiple studies of various types. So, it's just something that whenever you have a theory, it's just a theory.
Right.
It's not a fact. I mean, but as you have more and more evidence to support it in various ways, you have more confidence in it. So yeah, I mean, just the observational studies have been replicated. The kind of autopsy studies I've shown you, people who have Alzheimer's pathology but escaped having the disease, they're more likely to have higher education, higher occupational attainment. There's just a multitude of studies in support of these ideas. That's the only thing that you can do.
I read one of your earlier papers 10 or 12 years ago that I think it was you or someone else in New York City that you said when someone who's more highly educated is diagnosed with Alzheimer's, there's a much more rapid rate of decline. Is
Yes.
that true?
Yeah, I mean, I think I showed you the slides before. Yeah, that's what.
Did you have that on your slide?
Yeah, I did, because that's the one with the two lines, that one like that.
Right,
Yeah,
right.
so what happens is, again, it's a little counterintuitive, but because you're resisting the pathology for so long, by the time it takes over, you have less time. The pathology is bad, and by the time it takes over, it really takes over, and you decline more rapidly. And as I said, I think it's a good thing. Epidemiologists or sort of geriatricians talk about life expectancy, and then they divide it into non-disabled and disabled life expectancy, right? So it's one thing to live long, it's another thing to live long without disability. And so what you're doing here is you're living longer without the disability and shorter with the disability.
It's always better to go quicker.
I guess so.
We have a question over here. Dr. Stern, over here.
Yes.
Dr. Stern, thank you very much. I appreciate your good work. Thank you.
Sure.
Two questions. I was trying to discern really a timeline of the onset difference of Alzheimer's disease between people with high reserve and low reserve. And I'm just kind of scanning the graph. It looks like about a 4-year difference. Am I reading it right or wrong, or is there an answer?
Yeah, there is. I can't give you a number. There's if you look at the meta-analysis, I'm going to give someone a seizure by doing this. Sorry.
Yeah.
Because the way
Okay,
in the
page
back-
11, yeah.
I'm thinking of this graph here. So these are all the different studies that have found education, occupation as protective, except for one or two that did not. But on the very bottom, they have an effect size. Let me see this here.
Bottom, yeah.
No, I don't know if they have it here. In their paper, they actually come up with an effect size, which is a
Right.
statistical estimate of what it's buying you, and they compare it to drugs that we have. And so I don't know the years, but this effect size is larger than any drug that we have right now for treatment. So that's what I could say.
Okay, so we have to see if we can figure that out. Okay,
Yeah.
and then the other question is a very specific question about a particular cognitive task. I think commercially it's called double decision, and I think in the research, and there was a very large N
What's it called again?
double decision where there were two tasks that were spatially designed, so that you were trying to remember location and type of two different things at the same time, and that was touted as really having a significant impact in terms of a cognitive task. And you're saying,
Yeah, I mean, this is the thing with cognitive intervention. So I've done cognitive intervention also, not for Alzheimer's, but in normal aging. You try to pick a domain that's important and that you think if someone gets better at that, hopefully it'll help them do better in real life. I mean, just getting better at that double decision
No.
task is not such a good trick, you know? If it's sort of like these people who can memorize a list of 100 things. The literature says they're good at that, but that doesn't mean that they're great at anything else. So you want the experience to generalize to real life. So like I try to increase people's ability to allocate attention, and I was hoping that it would help
It was-
people like pay their bills better.
It was actually a longitudinal study. It was over about a nine or 15-year period, and they were measuring onset of Alzheimer's disease.
Yeah.
So
How'd they do?
they did better.
They did
according,
better.
according
So-
to the research.
Okay, so
that-
it
that was-
could be that I'm not aware of that study, but what I'm more worried about, or some of the products that are sold. I'll be now I'm on tape. I'm sorry, I said that. Someone, these various companies that sell these intellectual intervention, cognitive intervention tasks. It's not clear to me that there's evidence that they're really doing much. That's not saying that there could be specific tasks and specific, I really believe that the right set of tasks could make a difference. But yeah, I'm just not aware of them. So maybe that's a good example of one that I'm not aware of.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
I do, yeah. I'm over here. I just wondered if you had opinion about the use of neurofeedback with Alzheimer's.
No, I'm sorry, I really can't talk to that.
Okay.
I have a question about whether or not similar findings might be obtained working with patients with Parkinson's disease.
Yes. Can these ideas of cognitive reserve and brain reserve apply to Parkinson's disease? Yes. There have been some studies with Parkinson's disease. There have been studies with HIV dementia. I don't know if there's been studies with frontotemporal dementia. I have to see. Yeah, it's a kind of a concept that's been replicated. It's a very flexible one. So it's applicable to any situation where there are brain changes that are occurring that are causing a clinical outcome. So the answer is yes.
Do you think the concepts of brain reserve or cognitive reserve have any impact on who does and who does not experience delirium in the acute care setting?
I don't know the answer to that. I'm not sure about that. I think once the disease is really taken off, I'm not sure whether it would make a difference. And there could be a study like that, but I'm not aware of it.
Hi, I have a question about,
Right here, Dr. Smith.
oh, here I am.
Oh, there.
When you're talking about the cognitive reserve and IQ and education, has that been related to other neurological differences or developmental disabilities? I know there's a lot of studies with Down syndrome and other things. Has that been related at all in terms of what those individuals' IQ is and what their cognitive reserve and their brain reserve is because of neurological differences?
Yeah, so that's a very interesting. There's a lot embedded in your question. Some people have studied kids that are born with specific types or early on get specific types of brain lesions and how they recover from it, and the concept has been applied to that. I think there's been some studies of reserve in the context of people with various intellectual limitations that they're born with, and it pretty much holds out. So what could happen is that these people succumb to the brain pathology more readily. Now, an interesting sidebar to this is Down syndrome, because in Down syndrome, they have trisomy 21, the 21st chromosome is tripled, and some of the genes that generate amyloid are on there. So the thought is that many people, almost all people with Downs, almost inevitably will develop Alzheimer's disease. And there's a lot of people studying Downs as another Alzheimer's-like syndrome and trying to look at some of the things that I'm talking about there. Yeah. But, I think if you're starting from a lower intellectual level, it might be easier to succumb. I think that's a...
People who have vascular problems and other heart conditions, diabetes, hypertension, a lot of psychosomatic illnesses, how does that affect memory? And are they more vulnerable to Alzheimer's?
Yeah, I mean, the brain doesn't just get one thing. So you can have Alzheimer's disease, and then you can have these vascular changes, and they interact and make things worse. So all of the kinds of vascular risk factors that you're talking about are certainly exacerbate the process. Some people call it a mixed dementia, or you could say that these vascular changes exacerbate the process. But yeah, I mean, that's why. I mean, that's one of the, I think, where doctors have been quite successful on the whole is intervening for healthy heart. I just say that there's two trends that are going on. One, like I showed you those prevalence graphs, and they used to say maybe 50% of people at age 90 have Alzheimer's disease. But what's going on is that age where it's 50% is getting higher and higher. So there's what they call a secular trend, that people are living longer with less risk of Alzheimer's disease. There's another thing that's called the Flynn effect. People are just getting higher IQ. The average IQ increases over the years. So the thought is that heart healthy, good treatment of vascular risk factors and all of that is sort of lowering people's risk and allowing people to live longer before they get demented. And I would add to that society, our lives, at least in developed countries, are so stimulating and so demanding. I mean, look what you do when you call the bank. You're taking a working memory test. Press one for this, press two. All of our interactions are quite complex. When people have telephones, they learn this complex technology. So I think there's a secular trend that's occurring that I think is really, it's not getting rid of Alzheimer's, but it's sort of lowering prevalence slightly.
We have time for one more question.
Okay, let's get a good one.
All right, I think that may be it.
Okay. Okay, let me just tell you one thing, because I forgot to tell you but I've been talking about late life intervention. Nobody asked me this. I was hoping somebody would. What about better education? What about better treatment of children? So when I first published that JAMA article, I was interviewed by someone a reporter from 17 magazine, You're familiar with 17. So when I'm in other countries, I have to explain what it is. And I said, why is are your readers interested in this thing, this cognitive reserve? She said, well, stay in school. And she was way ahead of me, because we're talking about intervening in late life with all of this stuff, but these early interventions, better health for kids, better education, I think is another thing to really think about. Okay, thank you very much for your attention.